Now, Indian maize especially was a completely unfamiliar food in Irish culture, and completely unpalatable, therefore, to the Irish people. And this is true of all forms of famine relief that people discovered during the 20th century, that it wasn't just about the absence of food, it was about trying to find the right types of food to be able to provide relief to those who are starving. The second key point here is the absence of relief. Okay? So Mitchell is furious that the British provide no adequate relief. And of course Trevelyan is basically saying the relief has to be measured, because otherwise the Irish people will become dependent upon the munificence of the British Treasury. So here you have a famous image of an Irish, a hideous representation of an Irish person on the backs of an Englishman with a great big bag of money, to symbolize how they're meant to be getting off with things. But in actual fact, we know that even though a public works program was started, it lasted its funds were cut off very quickly. Similarly with the soup kitchens that ran for about 6 months in 1847. So the consequence was that all relief was channeled effectively, therefore, through the Irish Poor Law, which meant that it had to be paid by Irish property owners, okay, by basically through rates, which is like property tax. Okay, so Trevelyan's discipline was to make the Irish pay for their own relief. Another key part of Mitchell's argument was, of course, that this famine was orchestrated in order to restructure land holdings in Ireland. Okay? That the British despised the way in which cultivation in Ireland was primarily through small peasant plots. Peasant plots that were providing food for themselves but not generating a surplus to be sent to market. And therefore what you had to do was to remove these peasants from the land so that their farms could be merged and that they could be turned towards the production of wheat and of corn. Between 1846 and 1854, something like 500,000 people were evicted as tenants from their properties. And here you have a classic image of one such eviction. Finally, of course, the unbelievable flow of human traffic through the immigrant ships from Ireland and from Liverpool. 2 million people crossing the Atlantic or the Irish Sea, either to come to Britain, go to Britain, or to go to the US, creating a massive Irish diaspora right across the English-speaking world. In Australia, New Zealand, in North America, in South Africa, an immense scattering of people. Finally, I want to say something about how this famine and news of this famine played out back in Britain itself. Because it represented, I think, a chilling moment of realization. Remember that the newspaper press had been growing through the early 19th century, and you have a proliferation of reporters providing reports on the human suffering involved in the famine. Any numbers of humanitarian funds are set up in order to help the starving Irish, and of course sympathy for them is generated primarily through reports that focus on the suffering of innocent women and children. Okay? Everybody could always blame, in proper Malthusian ways, the male householder. He had bought, by not being able to support his family, he had reduced them to this state. But no one could blame the innocent child, and fewer could blame their mothers. What this flow of news reporting did, and in many ways it established all the conventions that famine reports still use. If you're reading reports of the ghastly famine in Somalia at the moment and watching news reports of them, you'll see that many of the same types of things are done. The front page of the New York Times this morning, I think, or maybe an inside page, has a picture not dissimilar to this of a starving 12-year-old who just arrived in a refugee base in Kenya. What these reports do, though, is not just establish that way in which we think about the reporting of famine and how we respond, but it also began to lead to real questionings about the morality of liberal political economy. So one of Malthus's greatest disciples was this Scottish evangelical known as Thomas Chalmers. And Chalmers began to think that that there's no way that the famine could actually represent a type of providential justice. And that actually what you begin to see is people beginning to think, well, maybe the system as a whole, maybe we can't just blame poverty and famine on individuals or on God. Maybe we have to think that there's some type of systemic problem with the operation of the market as naturally free. So ironically, what I'm suggesting to you is that this sort of moment of triumph where liberal political economy can be imposed in such a way that creates such human wreckage and yet, effectively go unquestioned until this moment, is also a moment of its vulnerability where people think, well, hang on, is what we're doing really what? Can this really be how it should be? And that's an important point and qualification to make. So before I do a final tour through the last part of the lecture, which will not be as long, questions. Have any of you learnt about the famine in other classes? There's a great Irish history course going on this semester. Is anyone taking it? With Professor Vady and Dungan? And the fact they start, what, late 18th century?
Yes, going over the wars and that's the context.
Right. How many of you have from Irish descent? Have Irish descent? So how many of you have heard a version of the story of the famine that I have just told you? Yeah, there's a great quote by someone's memoir that I read once, which is that the problem is with the English is that they can never remember what they can never remember what the Irish can never forget, And when the bicentennial? No, it couldn't have been bicentennial. The 150th anniversary, what is that? There's a complicated word that I couldn't possibly say it even if I knew what the word was. But there were agonized debates in Britain about whether Britain should have a formal apology for the famine when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. Slip of the tongue, President. Okay. So let's do the Great Exhibition, so to speak. The Great Exhibition was basically the world's first great trade fair, well, the world's first trade fair, great or not. It took place in this building that you see in this image here, which became known as the Crystal Palace, for reasons I'll explain to you in a moment, in London's Hyde Park, in the centre of London. And this building, known as Crystal Palace, was intended to be a monument to the benefits of free trade and the way in which it spread wealth and morality and peace and prosperity around the world. It's officially opened by Queen Victoria on the 1st of May 1851. So it opens just at the point in which the census returns from Ireland in 1851 are demonstrating that a massive loss of population in Ireland as a consequence of the famine. And it's made, the building is constructed of nothing but glass and steel. Okay? It's the first building in the world to be engineered and built out of glass and steel, which is why it became known as the Crystal Palace. Its architect, Joseph Paxton, was a humble, had risen from humble ranks. And there were something like 1,000 exhibits by 14,000 exhibitors from across the world. Okay, so it's the scale of the building is quite huge. It is, I'm going to suggest to you, not just a monument to free trade, it's a type of cathedral, a new type of cathedral for those who believe in liberal political economy. In the 6 months from May to October, more or less that's 6 months, I think, I'm not counting, 6 million people go to visit it. That's something like a sixth of the population of Britain at that moment. Now, I'm going to basically describe to you the exhibition in these categories. I'm going to talk to you about what it showcases in terms of the Workshop of the World and the Empire of Free Trade. I'm going to talk about what's not at the Great Exhibition, i.e. agriculture and labour, and then I'm going to talk to you about this rather perplexing term, the exhibitionary complex, okay, which is basically about how the Great Exhibition was intended to provide tools of emulation, rather like the Reverend George Clayton says in the reading that you were meant to do. So if you haven't done this reading and you've got a computer, I do it now because I'm going to ask you a few questions about it momentarily. Okay, so I'm not quite sure what that's there for, other than I guess it shows you a sense of the scale of the building. Let's do Empire first. So the Great Exhibition wanted to try and display the unity of the entire manufacturing process, the way in which free trade enabled people to exchange things with a type of perfect synchronized harmony and to mutual advantage. So it has displays of raw materials, it has displays of the process of manufacture, and it has displays of the finished goods. So it's trying to show, if you like, the unity of this process. Very critically, however, it puts different countries in different positions, and it therefore illustrates the sort of new global division of labour that the liberal political economy came to depend upon. And the East India Court is a great example of that. Remember that the East India Company is the trading company that still basically governed India before 1856.